A dense, unnatural silence hangs over the cobblestone streets of Florence in 1348, a silence not of peace, but of a profound and terrifying absence. The air, thick and fetid, carries a nauseating mixture of the sweet aroma of burnt herbs, the smell of sulphur, and the acrid odor of decay, which seeps through every crack of the barricaded windows. From the dark and abandoned alleys, where weeds are already beginning to sprout between the stones, comes the slow creaking sound of a wooden cart, pushed by ghostly hooded figures whose empty eyes betray a terror already numbed by exhaustion. "Bring out your dead," the voice cries, but it is a hoarse call, almost a whisper, devoid of urgency, for death is no longer an emergency but the new, relentless routine. Bodies, wrapped in simple shrouds or sometimes naked, are dragged from the doorsteps where grieving families have laid them, and piled onto the cart like firewood, their limbs stiff, and their bluish faces marked by black, grotesque swellings. The city, once a pulsating center of art, finance, and commerce, has become a vast and silent open-air tomb, where the few healthy living lock themselves away, envying the peace of the dead. And the only constant sound is the mournful tolling of church bells, until they too fall silent one by one, for there are no hands left to pull their ropes. This calamity, which Europe would come to know as the Great Plague or the Black Death, had its discreet and distant beginning on the arid steppes of Central Asia around 1330. Nestled in the fur of black rats and transported by insatiable fleas, the bacterium Yersinia pestis was an invisible, ancient and lethal passenger. It traveled west aboard the vast engine of trade and conquest, hidden in the caravans of the Silk Road among bales of silk and spices, and marching with the armies of the Golden Horde. The ignition point for Europe was the prolonged siege of the port city of Kaffa in the Crimea in 1346, when the mysterious disease devastated the besieging Mongol camp. Its leader, Jani Beg, in an act of primitive and desperate biological warfare, ordered the swollen and putrefied corpses of his soldiers to be catapulted over the walls. The Genoese merchants defending the city, terrified not only by the weapons but by the rain of death, eventually fled in their ships, unaware that they were carrying in their holds not only their goods, but the harbinger of the apocalypse. In the autumn of 1347, 12 of these ships, true death galleys with their tattered sails, arrived at the bustling Sicilian port of Messina. The crowd that gathered on the docks to welcome them, expecting news and goods, recoiled with a collective cry of horror. Most of the sailors were dead, rotting in their bunks or dying prostrate on the deck, their bodies covered in black boils the size of eggs that oozed pus and blood. The few survivors, delirious with fever and pain, their eyes glazed with terror, could barely explain the tragedy that had befallen them on the high seas. The panicked authorities hastily ordered the Phantom Fleet to be expelled from the port, but it was too late. The rats, agile and unnoticed, had already scurried down the mooring ropes. The fleas had already leaped onto new victims. The contagion had been planted on European soil, and from Messina, the plague spread like wildfire, following the vital arteries of trade to the heart of the continent. To the medieval mind, the enemy was invisible, supernatural, and incomprehensible. Without the knowledge of microorganisms or contagion, explanations turned to the divine and the superstitious. Doctors wearing beak-shaped masks filled with aromatic herbs to protect themselves spoke of a miasma, a corrupt and poisonous air released by earthquakes in distant lands or by the unfavorable alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. The clergy, in turn, preached with apocalyptic fervor that it was a divine punishment. The wrath of God poured out upon a humanity mired in sin, greed, and lust. People clung to amulets, carried flowers in their pockets to ward off the stench, lit bonfires of aromatic herbs on street corners, and prayed fervently. But death continued to reap indiscriminately, mocking their faith, their science, and their social status. The progression of the disease was terrifyingly rapid, methodical, and cruel. It began with symptoms that seemed common: high fever, violent chills, fatigue, and excruciating joint pain. Soon after, however, the buboes appeared, the painful hard swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck, which gave the bubonic plague its name. The victim's skin would then darken with purple and black spots, the result of subcutaneous hemorrhages, which earned it the name Black Death. The end, which came within a few days, was an agony of delirium and pain. There were also the pneumonic form, transmitted by coughing, which drowned the victim in their own blood, and the septicemic form, which poisoned the blood, killing in a matter of hours, even before the buboes could form. The very structure of society, once considered immutable and divinely ordained, began to disintegrate under the weight of abject fear and omnipresent death. The social fabric, tightly woven by family duties, feudal loyalty, and community obligations, frayed to the breaking point. Terrified parents abandoned sick children. Husbands left their wives to die alone, and brothers fled from brothers. Doctors refused to visit the sick, and priests, fearing for their own lives, hesitated to administer the last rites, leaving thousands of souls adrift. The streets became deserted, except for the gravediggers who, overworked and often drunk to endure the horror, could no longer dig individual graves. Mass graves were opened on the outskirts of the cities, where bodies were thrown in layers like lasagna, with a thin covering of earth between them, a macabre testament to the scale of the catastrophe. Amid the despair and chaos, extreme religious movements emerged, born of the deepest dread. Groups of flagellants roamed the countryside, marching from town to town in macabre and theatrical processions. Men and women, their faces covered by hoods and their backs bare and bloodied, rhythmically whipped themselves with leather scourges tipped with metal, singing mournful hymns and praying publicly. They believed that their self-inflicted suffering, an extreme and visible penance, could appease the wrath of God and save humanity. Their processions were a spectacle of fervor and horror, a public manifestation of the pain, guilt, and panic that consumed everyone. When penance and prayers proved ineffective, the frantic search for scapegoats intensified. Suspicion and hatred, fueled by centuries of prejudice, turned towards Jewish communities. Absurd and malicious rumors spread like the plague itself, accusing the Jews of poisoning the wells and springs to destroy Christendom. Despite papal bulls declaring the innocence of the Jews and forbidding their persecution, the mass hysteria was uncontrollable. In cities across France, Switzerland, and Germany, entire Jewish communities were surrounded, dragged from their homes, and burned alive on giant pyres or massacred by crazed mobs, in one of the darkest demonstrations of humanity's capacity, even in the face of a natural catastrophe, to inflict yet more suffering upon itself. When the first and most devastating wave of the plague finally subsided around 1351, it left behind a transformed and hollowed-out world. It is estimated that between 30% and 60% of Europe's population perished. This unprecedented loss of life, however, triggered a profound and unexpected socio-economic shift. With the drastic labor shortage, surviving peasants and artisans found themselves for the first time in a position of power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and an end to feudal obligations. If one lord refused, there were many others willing to pay, desperate for workers to cultivate their abandoned fields. This new and surprising power of the workers accelerated the collapse of the feudal system. Serfdom, which tied peasants to the land, began to disappear in much of Western Europe, and a new class of free and more prosperous peasants emerged. The power structures that had dominated the continent for centuries began to crumble. The Catholic Church, unable to explain or stop the plague, saw its authority and prestige severely shaken, paving the way for skepticism, critical thinking, and eventually the Protestant Reformation. The mass death forced innovation, with the development of labor-saving technologies such as the movable type printing press. The plague also left an indelible scar on the European psyche and culture. The art of the era became obsessed with death, suffering, and the transience of life. The theme of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became prominent in frescoes, woodcuts, and paintings. These works depicted animated skeletons dancing with people from all social classes, popes, kings, knights, and peasants, to the grave. It was a grim and democratic reminder that death was the great leveler, indifferent to power, wealth, or piety. The psychological trauma on the survivors manifested in contradictory and extreme ways. Some turned to an even more intense piety, donating their fortunes to the church in the hope of securing salvation. Others, as vividly described in Boccaccio's Decameron, adopted a hedonistic and fatalistic philosophy, seeking to enjoy the pleasures of life while they could under the constant shadow of mortality. The world seemed darker, more arbitrary, and less secure. a perception that would influence thought and art for generations. The spectre of the plague never truly vanished after 1351. Rather, it became a permanent, terrifying feature of European life. The Great Plague was not a singular event, but the opening salvo in a war against an invisible enemy that would span over 3 centuries. The disease became endemic, lurking in the population and erupting in successive, terrifying waves that reaped new generations. Cities like Venice and Milan pioneered public health responses born of desperation, creating health magistracies, lazarettos, quarantine hospitals, and the very concept of the 40-day quarantine, the quarantino, to isolate incoming ships and travelers. Yet the waves kept coming. The Italian plague of 1629-1631, the Great Plague of Seville in 1649, and the infamous Great Plague of London in 1665. Each outbreak was a horrifying echo of the first, bringing a familiar cycle of panic, the flight of the wealthy, the shuttering of homes marked with a red cross, and the relentless march of the death carts. With each generation, Europe shuddered, its collective memory scarred by the fragility of life and the ever-present proximity of annihilation. This constant dance with death shaped the European psyche, fostering both a deep-seated fatalism and a desperate, fervent grasp for life. The final retreat of the plague in the 18th century was not a victory of medicine, for no cure was found. It was a slow, multifaceted fading, driven by a complex combination of factors. The public health measures, honed over centuries of tragedy, became more systematic and effective. The cordon sanitaire, a brutal but effective military-enforced blockade of entire regions, could sometimes halt its spread. More crucial, perhaps, was an unseen ecological shift. The aggressive, larger brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, a creature of sewers and riverbanks, began to displace the smaller black rat, Rattus rattus, which had lived in intimate proximity to humans in the walls and roofs of their homes. By creating distance between the rodent host and humanity, this ecological change helped break the chain of transmission. Furthermore, scientists now speculate that both human and pathogen evolved. Surviving populations may have developed greater genetic resistance, while the Yersinia pestis bacterium itself may have evolved into less virulent strains, as a pathogen that does not immediately kill its host is more successful at propagation. Europe, through immense suffering and unconscious ecological change, had slowly and painfully learned to coexist with its invisible tormentor until it finally, almost imperceptibly, retreated into the shadows. In the end, the Black Death was far more than a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. It was the violent crucible in which the modern world was forged. It stands as a chilling example of an extinction-level event that paradoxically forced a rebirth. By shattering the rigid structures of the medieval world, it unintentionally cleared the ground for something new. The decimation of the workforce not only empowered the common laborer, but also irrevocably broke the bonds of feudalism, accelerating a shift toward a wage-based economy. The authority of the Church, which could offer neither explanation nor salvation, was fractured, creating a vacuum of certainty that allowed secular thought, humanism, and skepticism to rush in. This new focus on human potential and earthly life, rather than divine preordination, became the intellectual bedrock of the Renaissance. The plague did not just empty cities, it emptied minds of old unshakable certainties. The trauma forced a radical re-evaluation of humanity's place in the universe, a questioning that fueled art, science, and philosophy. The need to replicate texts with fewer scribes, so many of whom had perished in monasteries, spurred innovations like the printing press, which would later spread the revolutionary ideas of the Reformation. From the ashes of a continent depopulated and traumatized, a new civilization began to stir. It was a world more dynamic, more individualistic, and profoundly aware of its own mortality. A new Europe, forged in the fires of the greatest catastrophe in its history, was about to be born.